Paris, 1889, the city dressed in white lace and gold light preparing for the grand exposition, but in its narrow alleys and rain-glossed courtyards there was another story whispered from mouth to trembling mouth, the story of women who vanished on the cusp of marriage, each one young and radiant, each one with dreams pressed between the folds of her wedding dress. 27 brides to be gone without trace, as if the Seine itself had swallowed them in silence. It began with Colette Dupper, seamstress, with a shy smile and hands that stitched gowns worthy of queens. On the night before her wedding, she was seen leaving her small apartment carrying a parcel wrapped in blue cloth. No one saw her return the next morning. Her dress hung untouched in her room, the veil still folded like a prayer unanswered. There were no signs of a struggle, no footprints in the dust, only the faint smell of roses lingering in the air, though no roses had been in the room before. The city barely noticed. At first, Paris was a living organism breathing fashion and champagne, hiding its rot beneath velvet curtains. But as the disappearances grew, whispers began to ripple through cafes and marketplaces. The names changed: Colette, then Amélie, then Sylvie, and Margot, each one last seen near the old quarter by the shadow of St. Rosalie's Chapel, a place the younger women avoided, yet the older women crossed themselves when they passed. St. Rosalie's was a crumbling stone relic tucked between shuttered shops, its doors sealed for decades, its windows clouded by dust like blind eyes. Some said it had once been the site of a convent. Others claimed it had been a refuge for abandoned children, but the truth was older and less merciful. The chapel bell had not rung in 40 years, and yet on certain nights passers-by swore they heard it toll just once, deep and slow, as if marking a final hour. By the time the fifth bride vanished, the police could no longer ignore the pattern, though they treated it as coincidence. Men in heavy coats asked polite questions in parlors and kitchens, their notebooks filling with names and dates, but never with answers. Families were told to wait, to hope, to pray, as if prayer could stitch a wound that kept bleeding. For the women of Paris, the air grew heavier. An unspoken curfew settled over the city after sunset. Glances were exchanged in dress shops, where bolts of white silk began to feel like shrouds. Every wedding became a quiet defiance, every vow an act of courage or foolishness. The seamstresses whispered that the fabric itself knew the fate of its wearer, that the lace knots held secrets tighter than stitches could bind. One rainy evening, Genevieve Marceau was walking home from the bakery, her fiancé waiting for her with a bottle of wine and a letter he had written by candlelight. She never arrived, the baker swore. She left with a smile, her basket in hand, yet the next morning the basket was found in an alley, not a crumb inside. Not even the smell of bread, just a single white glove, damp and cold. There was a superstition now that if a bride passed St. Rosalie's alone, the bell would toll, and her fate was sealed. The sound would not be heard by anyone else, and the woman would feel only a shiver along her spine, as though unseen hands were lifting the veil before the groom could see her face. What bound these 27 women together was not wealth nor poverty, not faith nor doubt. It was the timing. Each disappearance occurred in the final hours before the wedding, as if something ancient and patient waited until joy was within reach before snatching it away. The people wondered if it was the work of a jealous spirit or something older than the church itself, something that remembered a time when vows were sealed in blood rather than gold. The newspapers began to print their names in small columns, alongside grainy sketches, the kind that made all faces look like ghosts. Mothers began to sleep in the rooms of their daughters, sewing needles clutched in their hands. Like weapons, lovers clung to each other in the flickering gaslight, wondering if they would be next, or if the shadow, stalking Paris, had eyes only for brides. And then came the 27th disappearance, the one that made the city tremble, as if the cobblestones themselves felt it. Asterisk. The 27th bride was Madeleine Rousseau, 22 years old, her hair the color of wheat in summer, her eyes carrying a softness that made strangers look twice. She was the daughter of a clockmaker, and the entire quarter adored her. The wedding was to take place at the edge of the Seine with music drifting over the water, her gown finished 2 weeks early, her bouquet already chosen on the evening. Before the ceremony, she stepped out to deliver a note to her cousin 3 streets away. She never returned. This time the city reacted not with whispers, but with a kind of cold dread. The streets in the quarter where she vanished seemed quieter even. The market sellers called out their prices without looking up. The bells of Notre Dame rang that morning, but no one seemed to hear them. Madeleine's father went to the police, not as a pleading man, but as a man who had already begun to understand. Something no one else wanted to name. The officers came again to ask their questions, but their voices were lower, their eyes less certain. The night Madeleine vanished, it had rained just enough to leave the cobblestones slick. The gaslights made the puddles glow like molten gold. There was a single witness, a lamplighter named Henry, who claimed he had seen her walking past St. Rosalie's. He said she had stopped in front of the chapel for reasons he could not guess. She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Henry swore that in that moment he felt the air grow colder, the kind of cold that slid under your skin. Before he could call out to her, she stepped forward into the shadow of the chapel doorway. Though the doors had been sealed for decades, he turned away for a moment to adjust his lantern. When he looked back, the doorway was empty, and the street was silent, except for the faintest toll of a bell. St. Rosalie's Chapel now stood at the very center of the fear. 27 women gone, most last seen in its shadow, yet no one dared break its seal. The city archives claimed the building had been decommissioned after a fire in 1842, though there were no visible burn marks. The parish records before that year had vanished entirely, leaving only the oldest citizens to mutter about nuns who took vows no church would approve, and a priest who disappeared one winter night taking half the congregation with him. Some said the chapel had been built over an older foundation, a shrine from before Paris was Paris. The stones brought from a burial ground where the earth never kept its dead. The great wooden doors were carved with strange interwoven patterns, almost like vines, but closer inspection showed them to be chains knotted together. Some had tried to pry the doors open over the years, but the hinges never moved, as if the building itself refused to let anyone in or out. It was around this time that a reporter from Le Petit Journal began his own investigation. His name was Julien Vautrin, and he had the kind of face that made people speak to him, even when they didn't trust him. He visited the families of the lost brides, recording their stories in a leather notebook. He never let out of his sight. What he found was chilling in each case. The bride had passed within sight of the chapel less than 24 hours before her disappearance. In some cases, twice in one day. Julien spoke with Henry, the lamplighter, and then with an old woman who lived across from the chapel. She was almost blind, yet claimed she could see the shadows in its doorway moving even when the moon was hidden. She told him the bell inside had not been rung by human hands in half a century, and yet she had heard it no fewer than 6 times each, one followed by another missing bride. She said the sound did not come through the air, but through the bones of anyone marked to hear it. By now, the women of Paris had changed their routes entirely. The narrow street where St. Rosalie stood was deserted after dark. In daylight, shopkeepers avoided glancing at it. The police made a show of guarding the area, but they never stayed after sunset. Even Julien admitted in his notes that when he stood before the chapel, he felt a pressure in his chest and the urge to leave quickly. Madeleine's case had something none of the others did: a single surviving object. Her father found it 3 days later, a lace ribbon from her gown caught in the iron hinge of the chapel door. When he touched it, the ribbon crumbled into threads, as if it had aged 100 years. In the space of a night, he kept what little remained in a small wooden box locked away and never spoke of it again. And yet, Paris kept moving. The carriages rolled, the cafes stayed open, the lovers still kissed on bridges. But beneath it all, there was a quiet understanding that somewhere behind those sealed doors, the 27 lost brides waited unseen and perhaps unaged, listening for the next toll of the bell. Julien Vautrin had never been a superstitious man. he prided himself on keeping his feet on the cobblestones of Paris and his head in the realm of facts. Yet by the third week of investigating the vanished brides, he began waking in the night with the taste of iron in his mouth and the image of St. Rosalie's doorway etched behind his eyelids. He told no one of the dreams, but they always began the same slow tolling of a bell, not in his ears, but in the center of his chest, followed by the sensation of walking barefoot over cold stone toward a door that should not open but died in. The morning of his fourth visit to the chapel, he brought a camera, an older box type with heavy plates and a folding lens. He had borrowed it from a photographer friend on the promise that he would return it within a week. The sun was low, the streets damp from a night rain when he arrived. Henry the lamplighter was across the square polishing glass, his hand shaking more than usual when he saw the reporter aiming the camera toward the chapel. He crossed himself without shame and walked away. Julian set the tripod directly in line with the chapel doors. The carvings on the wood looked different in the early light, less like chains, more like twisted limbs and bone. He adjusted the focus, but found the glass image clouded, as though the air before the doors was thicker than the rest of the street. He took the first plate anyway. The click of the shutter echoed strangely, not against stone, but as if swallowed by a larger space. Unseen, he placed the plate carefully into its case before taking another. When he opened the camera again to change it, he noticed the faint scent of roses, though no flowers grew within 3 streets of the place. That night in his small apartment on Rue des Bernardins, Julian developed the plates one after another. The first 3 came out blurred, but otherwise ordinary. On the 4th, he froze. The image showed the chapel doors open no more than the hand's width, a darkness spilling out. There was not shadow, but something denser. The edges of the opening were sharp enough to prove it was no flaw in the plate. And yet he knew he had not seen the doors move. 2 days later, he returned, this time with an old archivist named Delacroix, who had once served in the military and had a habit of carrying a small silver crucifix in his pocket. Delacroix had been following the cases quietly on his own, convinced the chapel had been built over what he called a plague pit from the 14th century, where bodies were buried hastily without rites. According to him, such ground never rested, and any church raised over it was more monument than sanctuary. They examined the street around the chapel. Tapping at the cobblestones, Delacroix noted the faint tilt of the ground toward the building, as if the weight beneath had shifted over time. At one point, he pressed his ear to the stone and told Julian he could hear a hollow far deeper than any basement. Then he refused to stand in that spot again. Julian's notes from that day record a curious incident. A woman in her 50s approached them selling matches. She told them she had been married once long ago. Her sister was to be her bridesmaid, but vanished the day before the wedding when she passed by St. Rosalie's. She said the match flames always bent toward the doorway. No matter the wind, she had stopped trying to understand why. That evening, Julian sent a draft of his findings to the editor of Le Petit Journal, but before it could be printed, the editor returned it with a short note: "Keep your ghost stories for the taverns. The paper will not touch them." He burned the note and kept working. The silence of the newsroom told him more than any printed words could. By now, the air in that part of Paris seemed to change for him entirely. He swore the light dimmed when he stepped into the square. The sound of carriages dulled until all he could hear was the slow imagined toll of the bell. One night, walking past, he noticed something new. The hinges of the great chapel door were glistening wet, though the sky was dry. Leaning closer, he saw the droplets were not water, but something thicker, darker. The smell was faint, but unmistakable. Julian told himself he would not go back again. Yet 2 mornings later, he found himself standing before the doors, without memory of leaving his bed, the street around him empty, the wind still. He stood for nearly a full minute staring at the wood, certain that if he waited another breath, the gap between the doors would widen and the darkness inside would call him by name. The morning he finally crossed the threshold of St. Rosalie's chapel, the city felt wrong from the first step out of his apartment. the air heavier than it should have been for winter, and carrying no sound from the river, the gas lamps on. Rue Saint-Jacques still burned faintly, though the sun was up, as if reluctant to surrender the night. Julien Vautrin walked without urgency, yet with the sense of moving along a path already laid down long before his birth. The great wooden doors stood shut when he arrived, their carvings seeming deeper now, shadows curling into hollows that could not have been cut by chisel. His fingers hovered over the handle, the wood colder than iron. When at last he pushed, the hinges gave without resistance, and the smell struck him first. It was not the damp stone of old churches, nor the wax of unlit candles. It was the scent of roses long dead, mixed with something metallic beneath, like a faint breath of blood from far below inside. The air pressed close around him, a darkness that did not yield to the morning light spilling in from the street. It clung to them. High arches where painted saints had once looked down, their faces now cracked and peeling. Their eyes faded into pale blanks. The floor bore a mosaic of lilies, half lost under centuries of grime, each petal dulled, but still carrying a suggestion of white. In the gloom, his footsteps echoed strangely, as though the space were far larger than the walls suggested. Julien moved slowly toward the altar, his notebook tucked under one arm, his other hand brushing against the pews, each worn smooth, not by years of worship, but by the restless shifting of those who had sat here uneasy in their prayers on the third pew from the front. He found a narrow groove in the wood when he ran his fingertip along it. He felt not splinters, but a thin residue, sticky even in the chill air. The altar itself was plain, yet behind it stood a tall triptych, the central panel depicting the Virgin in deep blue, her face downturned in grief. But the two side panels were strange, each showing a veiled woman holding a bouquet of lily, their veils painted so dark they seemed to drink the candlelight. One bouquet bore 7 flowers, the other 6, 13 in total, a number that lingered in his mind with unpleasant weight. Near the altar's base, the flagstones were uneven, one tile marked with a faint carved ring, as if it had once been lifted, often crouching. He pressed against it, but it did not move. He wrote in his notes, the words faint vibration beneath, cold to the touch, steady as breathing, then closed the notebook quickly, as if the act of writing the thought down gave it too much life. On the left wall, a confessional booth sat half open, the curtain moth-eaten inside the small chamber. The air was colder. Still on the seat lay a single bridal veil, yellowed with age, yet its lace still intact. He did not touch it, instead noting the faintest movement of the air toward the lattice, as if something on the other side was breathing in his presence. He stepped back into the nave, glancing once toward the doors still ajar, but the light from the street seemed further away than it should have been, as if the distance had stretched in the time. He had been inside. From somewhere above, a faint sound reached him, not the creak of wood or rustle of cloth, but a muffled chime, slow, deliberate, each note followed by a long silence, drawn by the sound. He found the narrow stair curling upward toward the bell tower, each step dusted with fine white powder like bone ground to dust the walls close enough to brush his shoulders. The smell stronger, here a mingling of rose and iron. When he reached the landing, he found the bell. Still, though the sound had stopped, there was no rope, only a thick chain disappearing into the shadows above on the floor beside. It lay another object, a small silver ring set with a pale stone, the metal darkened by tarnish. He picked it up and saw the initials MV engraved inside. The sight of it made his breath catch, for the name Marie Vautrin was carved into his family's headstone in Lyon, a cousin who had died before her wedding in the year 1883. He had never seen her face, only heard his mother speak once of her vanishing 2 days before the ceremony. The family told the world she had been taken by fever. The chain above stirred slightly, though no wind passed through the tower. Julien slid the ring into his pocket without thinking and turned back toward the stairs, yet the first step down seemed further than before, and as he placed his foot on it, he felt the faintest tremor pass through the wood, as if something deep below had shifted in answer to his movement. That night, sleep came to Julian in fragments. Thin sheets of shadow pulled across his vision, voices murmuring just beyond the range of sense. He woke twice to find the lamp still burning, yet convinced the room had been rearranged, the chair angled toward the bed, the curtains drawn without his hand touching them each time. He told himself it was fatigue, that long days in archives and longer hours. Walking old streets could twist the mind, yet when he closed his eyes, the chapel was there waiting in dreams. He moved through its nave, with no footsteps to mark his passing. The veiled women in the triptych now stood outside their painted frames, facing him, their bouquets fresh and glistening with dew, the petals dripping onto the stone floor, each drop vanishing before it could spread. When he tried to speak, their heads tilted together as if listening to some faraway sound, their veils rippling in a wind he could not feel. By morning, his hand shook enough that the ink bled on the page of his notebook. He tried to resume the historian's discipline, listing facts, dates, names, yet the lines tangled into half-sentences. He did not remember writing phrases like "she is still walking the aisle," and "they breathe through the walls." He tore the page free, crumpled it, and threw it toward the bin, though when he turned back, the page lay flat on the desk, the ink still wet. Food lost its taste. The city's familiar noise seemed muffled, as though cotton lay between him and the world. Once, in a cafe, he overheard two women speaking of a dressmaker in the Marais, whose shop closed decades ago. After a string of unpaid orders, all for bridal gowns in the same size and style, the detail lodged itself deep in him. He left his coffee untouched and walked for hours until the sun set and the Seine turned black under the bridges. That evening in his apartment, the scent of roses returned, faint at first, then sharper with each passing minute. He searched for the source, but found nothing until he opened the wardrobe and saw the veil from the chapel hanging beside his coat, the lace perfect, the fabric warm as if it had been worn only moments before his knees gave way, and he sat on the floor staring at it until the streetlights outside blinked into life. His dreams grew heavier, the voices clearer, speaking in a French that felt centuries old, each word slow, deliberate, not meant for him, but for something listening through him. He woke with scratches on his arms, thin as threads, and in the half-light saw his hands trembling over the notebook, though he had not lifted the pen, the page now bearing a single line. Return. Her ring days blurred into each other, the historian's careful logic peeling away layer by layer. He stopped writing to colleagues, stopped visiting the archives, his thoughts circling only the chapel, the ring, and the names of women he could not remember. Learning his own reflection seemed paler each time he caught it in glass, and once he thought he saw a veil draped over his head, only for it to vanish when he blinked one evening. Unable to resist, he returned to St. Rosalie's, the street outside empty, though the hour was not late. The doors opened at his touch, the same dead rose scent curling through the air, but this time the darkness inside seemed alive, shifting in slow tides. He stepped forward and felt the stone floor yield, as if the ground below had become hollow. The pews on either side warped into unfamiliar shapes, each seeming to lean toward him. The triptych no longer showed painted figures, the central panel empty, the side panels veils without bodies, bouquets suspended in midair. A low sound rose from beneath the altar. Not quite a voice, not quite a breath. His hand went to the ring in his pocket, and for the first time he felt heat in the metal, a steady throb that matched the rhythm of his pulse. In that moment he understood the chapel had been waiting not for prayers, not for confession, but for return. The veiled women, the vanished brides, the scent of roses, all circling toward one quiet truth. Something had been promised to this place, something it intended to reclaim, and in the dark hush between heartbeats, he could no longer tell if that promise had been made by his family or by himself. The days that followed took Julian past the threshold of exhaustion into something colder and quieter. The city no longer seemed to move around him. Instead, it drifted past like scenery beyond thick glass. His appetite vanished, yet he woke each morning with the faint metallic taste of blood behind his teeth. The scent of roses now clung to him in the street, on the stairwell, in the breath he released into the winter air. No matter how far he walked from St. Rosalie's, it seemed the chapel's shadow traveled with him, and strangers began to glance away quickly, as if unwilling to meet his gaze. Began to see the 27 brides in the edges of things, their outlines trembling in the reflection of cafe windows, their veils trailing across the puddles of the market square, only to vanish when he turned his head one afternoon while crossing Pont Saint-Michel. He saw a woman in white standing at the midpoint, gazing down into the black water. She did not move when he called out to her. She only lifted her hand, slowly revealing a silver ring glinting in the pale light before stepping forward into the Seine without a splash. The bridge was empty when he reached it. Sleep no longer brought rest, only the repeated dream of the triptych. But now the central panel was filled, the Virgin's face replaced with that of a bride whose veil billowed outward as though underwater. Her eyes the same gray as the Seine in rain. She held no bouquet, only the ring he carried. And each night she came closer until he woke with the sensation of her breath against his ear. The words unheard, yet lodged deep enough to make his bones ache. Found himself tracing the map of the city with no purpose other than to follow where the scent led each turn, drawing him nearer to the old quarter, each alley narrowing until the walls pressed close, the sky thinning above. Once he stopped before a shuttered shop, its sign so faded only the faint outline of shears and thread could be seen in the dust on the glass. A perfect handprint rested its size, unmistakably feminine, yet cold to the touch. The door behind it locked the interior, swallowed by shadow. It was here he began to understand the shape of the chapel's hunger. It was not random, it was patient. It had always known whom it would take. And when his cousin's initials in the ring were no accident, the line from her to him was unbroken, and as long as he kept the medal, it was not he who searched for the brides, but they who were closing in around him. On the 7th night, after finding the veil in his wardrobe, he woke to find his apartment stripped of color, the curtains, the walls, even his own skin dulled to shades of gray. Only the ring in his palm retained its glint. The window was open, though the air outside was still, and in the silence he heard the first toll, low and slow, not in the distance, but rising from the floor beneath him. The boards seemed to breathe, the shadows on the wall bending toward him in a slow lean. He walked without deciding to the door of St. Rosalie's, the city behind him, absent of sound, the doors parting before his hands could reach them. Inside, the pews were gone, the floor a single sheet of black stone slick underfoot, the air thick as if he had stepped beneath a river. The triptych floated above the altar, its panels turning slowly as though in unseen hands, and with each turn another veiled figure appeared, until all 27 stood in a perfect circle around him, their bouquets weeping petals that turned to ash before touching the ground. The heat of the ring burned. Now it seemed to pull at his fingers until he held it out. The nearest bride stepped forward, her veil brushing the floor without sound. She took the ring between her gloved fingers and slipped it onto her own hand, though he felt the band tighten around his own, as if she had placed it on him instead. The moment it settled, the toll came again, but this time it was not a bell. It was his heartbeat, deep, slow, final. The chapel's darkness closing in not as a threat, but as a sealing of what had always been decided. Understood then that the brides were not trapped. They were keeping vigil. They had waited through years, decades, centuries, for the return of what bound them all. And that bond was not a man or a vow or even a life, but a promise made on ground that never slept. A scent of roses swelled until it filled his lungs, leaving no air to take. And as his vision dimmed, he saw the veils lift, revealing faces pale and perfect, each mouth shaping the same word, not his name, but something older that he knew without learning. The last thing Julian felt was the floor yielding beneath him, not collapsing, but opening as if to receive him, the cold rising from below without malice, only certainty. The 27th bride's hand resting on his shoulder, the darkness swallowing the light from the doors, until Paris and its streets and its river were gone, and there was only the chapel, and the sound of the ring turning slowly on his finger. The story of the vanished brides had by now become an infection in the veins of Paris. Official channels avoided speaking of it, yet it surfaced everywhere, in taverns thick with pipe smoke, in the murmured gossip of laundresses by the Seine, in the wary eyes of policemen who no longer lingered near St. Rosalie's after sunset. The prefecture released a statement blaming a criminal network devoted to trafficking women, a theory that satisfied no one, not even those paid to write it. There was no evidence of forced entry, no witnesses beyond the rare and trembling few, and no demands for ransom. The police archives contained little beyond bland reports and false leads, each one ending with the same phrase in heavy black ink. Subject vanished without trace. Privately, the investigators divided into factions. One group clung to the belief that the chapel concealed a hidden passage into the catacombs, an entrance unknown to city records where the missing had been taken and disposed of. Another group, fewer in number but louder in their conviction, spoke of an older cause, that the foundation of St. Rosalie's was laid over a place where vows and lives had been offered to something not of the church. The archivist Delacroix returned to his military acquaintances with Julien's photographs, showing the faint sliver of the chapel's doors ajar. One officer, a veteran of the colonial campaigns, refused to look at the plates after the first glance. He claimed the darkness within was not the absence of light, but a substance, something that had depth, weight, and will not. Then came the whispered accounts from those who swore they had felt the chapel's attention. A market girl told Julien she avoided the street entirely for the last time she had passed its doors. Her bouquet of peonies had withered in her hands before she reached the next corner. A baker's apprentice described the sound of a bell inside his skull the moment he looked too long at its carvings. Church authorities were less forthcoming. The archdiocese insisted that St. Rosalie's was a matter for the municipal council, and that no priest had served there in living memory. Yet Julien unearthed a half-rotted ledger in a private collection showing that as late as 1841, the parish had been active. The final entry was written a cramped and hurried hand. Procession complete. Doors sealed. May she rest. No signature. Followed dot, and then there were the patterns in the disappearances, always within sight of the chapel, always within 24 hours of marriage, and always women who had worn or handled white lace in the days before. Julien noted this last detail with unease, remembering the veil that had appeared in his wardrobe without explanation. Rumors multiplied without proof. Some claimed the brides were taken beneath the Seine, their bodies drifting in a current that never reached the river's surface. Others said they had been claimed as spectral attendants for a wedding that would never be completed, a ceremony bound to repeat until the end of time. Julien did not know which theory to believe. He only knew that the ring in his pocket seemed warmer by the day, and that the darkness in the chapel photograph no longer seemed content to stay confined to its frame. When he closed his eyes, it was closer, and each time he woke, the faint toll of a bell lingered in the air, as though it had been waiting for him to listen. Paris would forget the names. That is how the city survives, by swallowing its dead into the folds of its streets, until memory itself becomes just another layer of stone beneath the feet of strangers. The newspapers turned their ink to other tragedies, other scandals, but the narrow street of St. Rosalie's did not change. Its windows stayed blind, its doors stayed shut, and in the cracks of the stone, the faint scent of roses never faded. Some swore they could still hear footsteps on the chapel floor long after. Midnight, soft and measured, like a bride rehearsing her walk to the altar. Others said that on certain mornings, when the light broke over the Seine in a thin gray sheet, the bell would toll once, not enough to call the living, only enough to remind the dead. Julien's apartment stood empty within a week of his last visit. His notes, his photographs, his ink-stained desk gone, as though they had never existed. The neighbors remembered the sound of his typewriter in the evenings, but could not agree on the day it stopped. Some claimed to have seen him walking the market at dawn, a veil trailing from his hand. Though the stalls were still shuttered and the streets slick with dewdot in the archives, the ledger of the chapel remains untouched. Its last entry sits in faded ink, the paper brittle, the words unchanging. Procession complete. No date, no name, and still, the number stays the same -20-7. It is never 28. But when the wind shifts over the river and the light in the quarter dims without warning, you may see the shadow of a 28th veil lift in the chapel's doorway. Perhaps it is waiting. Perhaps it already knows your name.